Hi, everybody. Okay, we have reached the last chapter of the semester on adolescence and problems. Now, fortunately, very few adolescents suffer few, if any, serious or enduring problems, but we also know the teen years are a time of life when certain problems are more likely to occur than at other times. So let's, or we would if we were in class, talk a minute about some of the main problems that you think adolescents face today. I would have you think about this and then I would write on the board. You would probably say things like drug use, alcohol use, social media, problematic internet use, and we could add things like auto accidents, eating disorders, for some kids, criminal behavior and depression. So there are a number of them. What I'd like to do here today is to put the problems that they face into a context because there are a lot of potential ones, so let's try and categorize them here a little bit. And the way we'll do this is by labeling them as either internalizing problems or externalizing problems, so IP or EP. So this is a way of looking at problems from a very broad perspective. We'll start with internalizing problems. These occur when adolescents turn their distress inward on themselves. Some examples would be eating disorders, depression, anxiety. Of course, this is a picture. This is also not an edited or altered picture of, excuse me, a famous model a number of years ago who she did eventually pass away from her eating disorder. And we know that for individuals, for adolescents who have internalizing problems, we call them over-controlled. So what that means is that they oftentimes will come from families where their parents have tight psychological control. So the teens may often have personalities that are overly controlled, and self-punishing is a way to think about it. So they turn their distress in on themselves, and that's really exactly what eating disorders, depression, and anxiety are all about. We tend to see these more in girls than boys. As we're going to see here in a minute, boys are more likely to externalize their problems. And then the internalizing problems very often will go together. For example, if someone has an eating disorder, depression is also very likely to occur. Some other differences that we see, adolescents with internalizing, excuse me, let me do externalizing problems here first. I was getting a little ahead of myself. Externalizing problems are when distress is directed outward, turned on to the environment rather than turned inward. So behaviors like delinquency or fighting, substance abuse, risky driving, risky sexual behaviors, all those would be considered externalizing problems. And we would say that these teens are under-controlled, meaning that they lack self-control and that parental monitoring is also most likely diminished. So adolescents lack self-control themselves. And that's one of the ways that kids do learn to self-control is by their parents' moderate amount of control of them. And then these are diagnosed more commonly in boys than girls that we see. Now, I do want to make a disclaimer with this chapter. We're going to be talking here in a minute about depression and suicide. So if any of you do not wish to listen to that recorded lecture, I will have this on Blackboard under the unrecorded lecture. So if you would rather just look at the slides rather than listen to the narrated. Okay, some other differences here. Teens with internalizing problems usually experience distress. They will tell you that they feel bad. So depression, for example. Those with externalizing problems typically don't feel distress. They won't tell you that they feel bad, but they are acting it out. So, for example, in the case of delinquency. An externalizing problem, those kids are motivated not by unhappiness or by any kind of psychological problem per se, but more a desire for excitement and intense experiences. They're just looking for something new and something exciting. Some adolescents, of course, can have both externalizing problems and internalizing problems. So we see very commonly someone who's diagnosed with alcohol abuse or substance abuse also is diagnosed with depression. Okay, so we're going to start with internalizing problems, and the main one we're going to talk about is depression and suicide in teens. So for depression, this is a whole week itself topic. So I just want to hit some highlights, things that I think are important for you to know. Depression can be either a mood or a disorder. A mood is transient. So we all get bummed out. We all get depressed sometimes, sometimes for a few days. But a disorder is longer lasting and it becomes out of proportion with reality and maladaptive. So if depression is starting to interfere with work or school or friendships, then we're probably looking at something more like a disorder. As far as the symptoms of depression, the first thing I want to tell you about are just some of the basic symptoms we look for, and then some of the symptoms that we see particularly in teenagers. So I'm going to categorize these to make it easy. For general symptoms of depression, the SX is short for symptoms. We look for emotional symptoms like crying or hopelessness, depressed mood, negative attitudes about the self, things along those lines. For cognitive symptoms, we are looking for things like low self-esteem, memory and concentration problems. These are very commonly things that we see in adolescents. Self-punitive thoughts, so teens saying things like I'm awful, or I'm no good, or I can't do anything right. Motivational symptoms would include things like anhedonia. That's a good word for you to use. You've heard the word hedonism. Well, anhedonia means a lack of pleasure. Hedonism means pleasure, and anhedonia means a lack of pleasure. Of course, thoughts of suicide or self-harm, and then a lack of self-care, neglecting to take a shower or take care of yourself. The fourth category would be physical symptoms, and here what we're seeing, there's a number of things, sleep changes and appetite disturbance. So what we're looking for are changes from the usual. Some people with depression sleep a lot, some people hardly sleep at all. The most typical sleep pattern in depression that we see is when a person takes a long time to go to sleep at night, and then they wake up really early in the morning and have trouble going back to sleep. And then appetite disturbance. Some people have no appetite when they're depressed. Some people have an excessive appetite, but if it's changed, if it's different for the person, that's what's important. And then fatigue. People will talk about feeling just tired a lot of the times, and this is true even if they are sleeping excessively, just really feeling tired much of the time. So as far as a few statistics here are concerned, about 5% of teens we know show severe depression. A larger number than that show mild or moderate depression, and of course we're most concerned about the ones that show severe depression. Now, prior to adolescence, we see about equal rates in boys and girls, but then after adolescence, we see more cases in girls, about 3 times more cases. Part of that may be how boys and girls express their distress differently. Boys are more likely to externalize, so substance use, getting into trouble, delinquency. That may be how they express their depression, whereas girls are more likely to express the typical signs of depression, the crying and feeling hopeless and feeling sad. So another way to think about this regarding depression is that girls are intrapunitive. Punitive means punish, so they punish themselves internally, so feeling bad, feeling shame. Boys are what we call extra punitive, so they lash out and may hurt other people. That's a way to think about that. Okay, one example of this is, let's take a breakup. How do girls oftentimes and I know this is being terribly stereotypical, but there's some research behind it. How do girls typically behave after a breakup? They cry, they talk to their friends, they feel sad, they feel forlorn, they may wonder if they'll ever be with anybody again. And what do boys do? Boys will often start dating somebody else right away, get involved with somebody else, try and take their mind off of it. They may do things, just acting out in other ways. So that is another good example of how that internal versus external tends to show. Now, all those symptoms that I just gave you are typical symptoms of depression, but we know they vary a little bit when it comes to adolescence. So let's talk about what I'm going to call the depressive equivalents in adolescence. What are some of the signs of depression that we see specifically in teenagers? Okay, these would be things like, I mentioned this one, but again, lack of concentration. So grades oftentimes take a real hit for depression in adolescents. Running away, that's really a whole separate subject, but we do see that among teenagers. Sexual acting out, just kind of switching from partner to partner. That's especially true for girls, by the way. Boredom and restlessness. Kids will talk about how they're just bored all the time. And then particularly for boys, aggression and delinquency. So we've done a lot. There's been really a lot of research on teen depression, and one of the biggest studies being done on teens and mental health is the National Institute of Mental Health longitudinal study on depression. And they've been releasing data over a number of years, and a study that just came out as part of this a couple of years ago, some recent findings on teen depression. And this is a huge study. They looked at 11,000 twins, big sample size. And we're looking at the relationship between bullying and depression, and found that kids who were bullied at age 11, as compared to kids who weren't bullied, expressed more anxiety, more depression, were more likely to evidence attention deficit disorder. But by the age of 14, and by the age of 14, I should say, their anxiety had increased, but by the age of 16, they weren't having as many problems. So, there's certainly evidence that the effects of bullying can be long lasting, but in a lot of kids, that seems to get better as they reach mid-adolescence. Another really interesting study released the same year looked at the relationship between sleep and depression. This was an 8-year longitudinal study that looked at 15,000 subjects, so just really well respected. It found that teens who get less than 6 hours of sleep a night are 3 times more likely to consider hurting themselves and 4 times more likely to actually attempt self-harm and be depressed. So there is a close relationship between the amount of sleep and feelings of depression and self-harm for kids. The problem is that's pretty much an epidemic among high school students. 70% of high school students get less than 8 hours a night. So the recommended amount is 8 hours a night. We know kids need a lot of sleep, but teenagers also continue to need quite a bit of sleep. But it's important to understand that this study is all self-report, so they were asking teenagers their opinions on things, how they were doing, and it was also correlational. So we are not saying that sleep causes kids to have those rates of depression. Okay, here's the section where we talk about self-harm. So again, if you want to bow out of this part of the lecture, that's obviously totally okay. These slides are going to be available on Blackboard. But we can't talk about depression and problems in adolescence without talking about suicide, which is the third leading cause of death among the adolescent population. And we have a lot of statistics showing the commonalities of it. 6% of adolescents will admit that they have attempted suicide before, they have attempted to harm themselves. And these can be anything from soft attempts, such as taking a few pills, to more serious attempts. 15% report that they have come close to attempting. 60% of teens say they know somebody who attempted to harm themselves. And then 15% report that they knew a teenager who died by suicide. We know that there certainly is a gender influence on self-harm behavior. Here is a pretty good video that I will go ahead and link down in the description section. So if you have a couple of minutes to go ahead and take a look at that. Just a couple quick things about gender. We know that males are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than females, largely because males use more lethal methods, firearms, hanging. Women, oftentimes, females will use pills. And we know that most people do not, fortunately, know how to use pills to cause serious harm to themselves. And we know that males often tend to be more psychiatrically disturbed, which can lead to suicide. But we also know that the failed attempts are higher for females, and they range 5 times more likely to make attempts than males do. One of the big problems we have with getting good statistics is that statistics on suicide attempts are not kept. There are no formal records. And the reason is because it's not always clear. For instance, a lot of single car accidents are chalked up where a person dies, are chalked up to accidents, but we know just through doing what they call psychological autopsies that many single car accidents are in fact attempts at self-harm. The same with overdoses. There really aren't too many actual accidental overdoses. They are very often attempts at self-harm. But the guesstimate is that there are between 200 and 300 attempts for every person who does die by suicide. So just some things to keep in mind. Okay, going on here. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the correlates of adolescent suicide, some of the things that seem to lead to that. First of all, let's talk about the role of family and family problems. We know that kids who attempt suicide or die by suicide are more likely to have unstable families with instability. They feel unneeded. Many times parent-child role reversals are in play. So if the parents have a mental illness or oftentimes a substance abuse problem, the kids end up taking care of the parents. And then there are a host of personality or mental health issues that oftentimes go along with attempts at self-harm. For example, depression. Now, not all people who attempt self-harm are depressed. That's not all people that attempt self-harm or take their lives by suicide have depression or mental illness. But there is very commonly an over-reliance on limited support. So these teens are more likely to have very few, very intense relationships. They might have one or two friends that are their whole world. And if something happens with one of those, there's really a problem. More likely to have weak communication skills, so it's more difficult for them to ask for help when they need it. They may be hypersensitive, so that means kind of looking for criticism, taking things much more personally than what was intended. Kids may have magical thinking, and we see this sometimes. I've had my share of adolescents who have thought about self-harm, and oftentimes their intention is to get back at somebody or to get revenge or to get even with someone, to make someone feel bad. And so then I'll say to the teenager, well, how do you know that's going to happen? And they'll say, well, I'll be able to tell. And I'll say, but you're going to be dead. How would you know that? And it's literally almost a light bulb going on for them. It's like they didn't even realize something like that. Feelings of helplessness are more likely. These teens don't think that they can really make a change in their lives, and they are less likely to have strong problem-solving skills that can help them overcome some of these issues. More results from a study. Now, this one was actually done at Ohio State, a study on brain functioning and adolescent self-harm. And this one examined 40 females. Half of those, 20 of those, had a history of self-harm. And the MRIs of those who had a history of self-harm showed reduced volume in parts of the cerebral cortex. In particular, the insular cortex, which you can see right here. This is the part of the cerebral cortex in between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe, and that's largely in charge of emotional responses and emotional control. And then also reduced volume in the frontal gyrus, which is right in here. Here's the inferior frontal gyrus, and this is in charge of response inhibition. So if you have a tendency to be impulsive or to do something without thinking, functioning in the frontal gyrus may intervene. So if there is less functioning there, then that makes sense that those folks would be the one to initiate more self-harm. We also know from this study, it's just a really big, interesting study, that those who engaged in self-harm, that was associated with more intense experience of emotions. And in fact, that's why many of these individuals engage in self-harm, because it helps them manage their emotions. They also looked at self-injury in emergency room visits. And this study found that every year, those females between the ages of 10 and 14 who have to go to the emergency room, about 19% a year are for self-injury kinds of needing that care. We also know that self-injury and attempts at self-harm are very common in adult borderline personality disorder. So getting that diagnosed earlier, and usually that emerges in the teen years, getting that diagnosed and properly treated in the teenage years is a helpful thing to try to prevent some of those problems when kids are older. So you can absolutely address some of those harmful behaviors early on. Now, the last thing I want to address in terms of self-injurious or suicidal behavior is the role of the media. And in particular, y'all remember a few years ago when that show on Netflix came out, 13 Reasons Why. And I will say I watched probably 3/4 of the episodes and just didn't like the feeling it gave me. I was just really pulled down by it and just decided not to continue watching. But I read the synopsis, so I know how it ends. Scientists studied this show because they were really curious about the impact that it would have. And in fact, it had an impact. They found a 29% increase in suicides in 10 to 17-year-olds in the month after that show's release. That is huge. That is the highest monthly increase that they had seen in 5 years. Researchers had seen in 5 years. So, we have freedom of speech and all that. They didn't pull the show, but it was lots of guidelines and instructions came out helping parents try to figure out how can they allow their kids who wanted to watch that show and also deal with it in a healthy manner. So the last thing I want to talk about just in this particular section is what to do. What can you do when you suspect someone is thinking about hurting themselves or you get the sense that someone's thinking about hurting themselves? There are absolutely some things you can do. So first of all, you want to take the person seriously. Don't assume they're joking. Don't just blow them off and say, oh, don't talk like that. Talk with them about it. Ask them what they're thinking. Stay with them. If you feel comfortable asking them a little bit more about, to see if you can find out if they have a weapon or what they're planning on doing. Now, of course, you certainly can bypass all of this, take them straight to their parents or a professor or a counselor or a teacher at school, and they can take over. But the main thing to do is to not abandon the person. You can, of course, call the National Suicide Prevention Line, and there is a text line where people can talk with trained crisis counselors on the spot. You can always take people to the emergency room. So the bottom line is, and you are not a mental health professional. You are not expected, nor can you treat them or help them get over this. They need to have professional help. And of course, if it's a teenager, you cannot, if you're a friend and your friend says, don't tell anybody, don't tell my parents, you can't keep that promise. I mean, you're not legally obligated, but in the way of safety, you can't. And you might end up losing a friend over it, but it's better to lose a friendship than to actually lose the person. It's just such a hard thing, but there are ways you can intervene. Okay, we're going to move on and talk about externalizing problems now. And we are going to talk about binge drinking in particular and then vaping for a couple of minutes. So we'll start off by talking about binge drinking, and we'll play a little drinking quiz here to start off with. So I've got 3 questions on the next slide. Just jot down whether you think that they are true or false. So the first one is, binge drinking means having 5 or more drinks on one occasion. True or false? Number 2, 1 12-ounce beer equals 5 ounces of wine equals 1.5 ounces of a shot of liquor in terms of alcohol content. True or false? Alcohol is a stimulant. I lied, there's 4 questions. And then finally, having 1 drink can make you fail a breath test. Okay, so what are the answers to this? Number 1, binge drinking means having 5 or more drinks on one occasion. That is true. Now we're assuming approximately equal alcohol content. Number 2, 1 12-ounce beer equals a 5-ounce glass of wine as a shot and a half of liquor. That is also true. Number 3, alcohol is a stimulant. Many of you know that. It is false. Alcohol is a depressant. And then the last one, having 1 drink can make you fail an alcohol test. That is true. That is true, depending on your body weight, your tolerance level, and also the amount of alcohol that you had in that particular drink. All right, so let's talk a little bit about binge drinking, which, as you all know, is a popular thing among college students and a potential problem. There was a really interesting study done in the 80s called Why People Drink Themselves. It's called the Why People Drink Themselves Silly study. It was done in the 80s, and what they did was brought students into a lab, and everybody gave informed consent that they would be having a drink with alcohol, and they gave half of the people in the study real alcohol, and then the other half of the people were given an alcohol flavored drink that actually did not have any alcohol. And they gave people the opportunity to have a couple of drinks, whether they were in the control group or the experimental group, and then they gave them some tasks to do and some games to play. And the researchers studied them through video camera, and they found that the people who drank the non-alcohol acted basically the same way as the people who drank the alcohol. It was like the suggestion it was a strong placebo effect. The suggestion or the idea of drinking lowered people's inhibitions and had them behaving very much in the same way. Now, as we just said, binge drinkers, so more than 5 drinks over a period of 24 hours. A survey done or a study done that was published in the journal of Pediatrics a number of years ago looked at, again, a huge sample, over 15,000 students. They surveyed through a CDC, Center for Disease Control survey, and found that 2/3 of high school students who admit that they drink, also admit binging. So most high school students who drink admit that they binge sometimes, and almost half of those admit that they had binged in the last month. And this was even more prevalent for boys versus girls. Additionally, we know a few things about kids who are more likely to binge drink, and these are real problems. Kids who binge drink, and this is both males and females, are 4 times more likely to either perpetrate or be a victim of sexual assault or dating violence. Alcohol just does bad things, can do bad things. They are 5 times more likely to be sexually active, and then they are 19 times more likely to be a smoker. So the combination of the alcohol and the cigarettes just does a lot of things. We also know that kids who binge drink are 4 times more likely to have a suicide attempt, because binge drinking speaks about a person's mental health, about their coping mechanisms, and so all those are tied together. An interesting study found that the highest areas of binge drinking in the country are some of the kind of the north, sort of the Midwestern states, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota. I don't know if it's because there's a lot of vast land and there's nothing else to do. I'm not sure. The lowest areas are a little bit surprising. The DC area, LA, and Detroit, major cities. So those are the lowest and highest rates of binge drinking. We have to ask the question, of course, why is binge drinking so appealing to adolescents? What is it about it? And what strategies might help adolescents make wise decisions about their behavior with alcohol? So I would like for you to take a look at this video. It's just a couple of minutes, Teen Girls and Binge Drinking, and it gives some information answering both of those questions, because answering both of those questions is going to be required to try and cut down on the rates among teenagers. A little bit more here in terms of what we know. A study that was published about 10 years ago in a leading journal, Psychology of Addictive Behaviors, looked at, this was an interesting one, they looked at kids who were between 12 and 14, and they looked at them before they reported that they had been drinking. Like, I don't mean on a night, I mean they got to these kids before they'd ever started drinking, and then once they had started drinking. So it was a longitudinal study. And the kids that did drank 3 to 5 drinks a time, 2 to 3 times a month. Those were the reports. And so we're counting this as binge drinking, even though we said it's five or more. You know, if you're 12 years old and you're having 3 or 4 drinks at a time, that qualifies for binge drinking. So those kids who did report binge drinking, for females, they did a lot worse on spatial functioning tests, and boys did worse on tests of attention. So the result coming out of this is that drinking that much at a young age tends to damage white matter nerve tissue in the brain. So they looked at the kids, they did MRIs before they'd ever had any alcohol, and then after they started, and the kids who drank the most had some pretty serious brain problems. And so we know that poor white matter leads to ineffective communication between the brain cells. So if you look at this slide, the images above show how much more active a 15-year-old non-drinker's brain, here's a non-drinker's brain, than a drinker's brain. So these are either PET scans or fMRIs and showing the amount of activity. So these are kids who are binging an average of 1 to 2 times a month, 4 to 5 drinks each. That doesn't sound like much, but what it's showing is that there is some significant brain damage that's being done. Because remember, all of this cortex, the brain is still growing until you're in your mid-20s. They also found that teens had a higher tolerance for the negative effects of binge drinking. So the teens who binge drank had a higher tolerance for the effects, so the hangovers and the blackouts, than kids who do not binge drink. Now, is this reversible? The answer is they don't know. They're working on looking at that problem, but the concern is that there may be some short-term reversibility, but it does damage in the long term. So we really need some interventions for these kids that are drinking that much at a young age. Now, what about teenagers whose parents say, I know you're going to drink, so drink at home. We'll have your friends come over here, we'll get the alcohol, drink at home. Is that okay? Well, here's what the studies show. So the parents are saying it's okay, a study done from just a couple of years ago. Another longitudinal study looked at 2,000 teenagers, 2,000 subjects, all between 7th and 12th grade, so kind of a 5-year, looked at them between 7th grade and 12th grade, found that 81% who got alcohol from their parents confirmed that they binge drank. So of all these kids who say that, yeah, my parents buy me alcohol and let me drink at home, 81% of those confirm binge drinking versus 60% who didn't get it from their parents confirmed binge drinking. So you might think, 60, 80, that's not a big difference. That really is a big difference. That's a highly significant difference. So showing that when parents, with good intentions much of the time, maybe not all of the time, decide to buy their kids alcohol, it can end up really just causing even worse problems. Okay, the last topic we'll talk about here, and also an externalizing problem, is vaping. So this is, of course, you all know this, the use of e-cigarettes. Here is just a graphic of a number of ways that they come. Most of the e-cigarettes contain nicotine, which is the addictive component, and they produce an aerosol with a liquid. And the reason people like vaping is because they argue that a lot of the dangerous chemicals from cigarettes are removed. So lots of studies have been undertaken to look at the legitimacy of that. Is that really true or not? A study just published last year by the National Institute of Health found just how common vaping is among adolescents. So take a look at this. By 8th grade, almost 2% of kids reported that they vaped regularly. Okay, that's not much, but 8th grade, you're 13 then. By 10th grade, it's up to 7%, and by 12th grade, about 11.5%. So the rates of vaping increase steadily over the adolescent span. Some of the graphics on this chart repeat the information that I just told you, but I want to point your attention over here. Nicotine vaping in the past month. So for 8th graders, 10% report that they have vaped in the past month, 20% 10th graders, and a quarter of 12th graders report that they have vaped in the past month. And this is a big National Institute of Health study. Highly significant here and very worrisome. Okay, now this one looks at THC vaping and how this is a little bit different. So the numbers are a little bit lower in the past month. So almost 4% of 8th graders, 12% and 14% of 10th and 12th graders. But these are still large increases. So if you take a look at this, you can see that daily THC vaping. They're saying almost 1% of eighth graders and up to 3.5% of 12th graders are vaping THC daily. That's tens of thousands of kids. Okay, next graphic. This one's really interesting to me. What are the reasons for vaping? Now we're just talking about nicotine here, not the THC. So the highest percentage are kids who said, I just want to see what it's like. So many people are doing it. I just want to see what it's like. Um, and then it just goes down because it tastes good, to relax. I want to have a good time with my friends, to feel good or to get high. In the case of THC, just bored. It looks cool. Some of them, and they say the rates have doubled. This was between 2018, 2019, is because I'm hooked. So of course nicotine is addictive. That's what that's all about. And then a few because they can't smoke cigarettes. So those are just something to keep in mind. So the people that think that vaping is harmless, you all have seen the studies in the news, the research in the news about the lung damage that it can cause for kids. Kids have died from vaping, so just something to keep in mind. Here's a little bit more just to end with why vaping is unsafe. It absolutely affects the brain. Nicotine harms the prefrontal cortex. Of course, that's the part that's still growing in adolescence. So whether you're cigarette smoking or vaping, there is still harm that's coming. We know that people who use nicotine in whatever form have a higher risk of developing psychological disorders and dementia. And that is particularly true when adolescents are doing it, because the earlier you start, the more impact on the brain it has. It is more harmful to lungs in adolescence, which is why we see cases of kids dying and seriously injured from vaping in adolescence versus adults. And then it interferes with that synaptic pruning procedure that we talked about, which is important for brain development among adolescents. So I like this picture here. It's like a vending machine. It's not like you can buy a new brain. The human brain is the last organ to fully develop at around age 25, which we talked about. Nicotine in e-cigarettes can harm brain development and lead to addiction in youth and young adults. Let's protect our kids. So vaping is absolutely not harmless, and it's really important to devise interventions to try and keep kids from even starting in the first place.